The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 42nd floor, casting shifting shadows across the marble reception desk where Sarah Mitchell sat, her fingers dancing across the keyboard with mechanical precision. At 28, she had perfected the art of corporate invisibility, the kind that kept assistants employed and unnoticed in the gleaming towers of Manhattan's financial district. Blackwood & Associates prided itself on discretion. The private equity firm managed portfolios that could topple governments, yet their reception area whispered wealth rather than screamed it. Sarah had worked there for 3 years, long enough to recognize the subtle tells, the way Mr. Blackwood's jaw tightened when certain names appeared on his calendar, how visitors' hands trembled when they signed the NDAs, the peculiar silence that followed phone calls from Switzerland. The phone rang at 4:47 p.m. on a Thursday. Sarah glanced at the caller ID. International, no name displayed. Standard protocol dictated she screen all calls, but something about the insistent ring felt different, urgent. Blackwood & Associates, Sarah speaking. How may I? Ist Heinrich da? The voice was sharp, elderly, with the authority of someone accustomed to immediate compliance. Sarah's breath caught. The German words hung in the air like a challenge. She hadn't spoken the language since her college semester in Berlin, but understanding flooded back with uncomfortable clarity. Is Heinrich there? Heinrich, not Henry, not Mr. Blackwood. Heinrich. I'm sorry. Could you repeat that in English? Sarah managed, her voice steady despite the sudden acceleration of her heartbeat. Heinrich Schwarzwald. I know he is there. Tell him his father calls. The line went dead. Sarah stared at the phone, her mind racing. Heinrich Schwarzwald. Henry Blackwood. The translation was almost too obvious, too neat. But why would someone be calling her boss by what sounded like a German name? She glanced toward the executive suite, where warm light spilled from beneath the heavy oak doors. Mr. Blackwood, Heinrich, was in his usual late-afternoon meeting with the compliance team. The same meeting that happened every Thursday, the same meeting that had coincidentally started 3 years ago, right after Sarah had been hired. The same meeting that always ended with shredded documents in the special disposal unit. Sarah's fingers hovered over the intercom button. Protocol demanded she relay all calls immediately. But something cold had settled in her stomach, a recognition she couldn't quite name. The caller's voice had carried more than authority. It had carried familiarity and fear. She thought of her grandmother, who had spoken German in hushed tones when she thought no one was listening, who had numbers tattooed on her wrist that she claimed were from a work accident, who had died clutching a photograph of a young man in a uniform Sarah had never been allowed to see clearly. Sarah opened her desk drawer and pulled out a legal pad, writing down everything she could remember about the call, the time, the number, the exact words. Ist Heinrich da? Tell him his father calls. Sarah's hands trembled as she stared at the legal pad, the German words seeming to burn into the paper. Heinrich Schwarzwald. The name felt foreign on her tongue, yet somehow familiar, like a melody half-remembered from childhood. She had exactly 17 minutes before Mr. Blackwood's meeting ended. 17 minutes to decide whether to pretend the call had never happened or to confront the possibility that her boss might not be who he claimed to be. The executive suite doors opened with their usual whisper-soft precision, and the compliance team filed out in their identical charcoal suits. Sarah watched them through her peripheral vision, noting how they avoided eye contact, how their briefcases seemed heavier than when they'd arrived. The weekly ritual of Thursday meetings had always struck her as odd. Compliance reviews typically happened monthly, not weekly, and never with such elaborate document destruction protocols. Henry Blackwood emerged last, his silver hair perfectly styled despite the late hour, his blue eyes scanning the reception area with the practiced awareness of someone who had learned to watch for threats. At 63, he moved with the fluid grace of a man who had spent decades perfecting the art of appearing unthreatening while commanding absolute authority. Sarah, any calls? His voice carried the slight accent she had always attributed to his East Coast boarding school education. Now, with the echo of German still fresh in her ears, she wondered if she had been hearing something else entirely. "Yes, sir. One international call, but they hung up before I could transfer them." The lie came easily, too easily. Sarah had always prided herself on her honesty, but something about the fear in the caller's voice had activated an instinct she didn't know she possessed. Blackwood's expression didn't change, but Sarah noticed the way his fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around his Mont Blanc pen. "I see. Did they leave a name?" "No, sir. Just static on the line." For a moment, neither of them moved. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, filled with questions neither was prepared to ask. Then Blackwood smiled, the same warm, paternal smile that had made Sarah feel safe and valued for 3 years. "Well, if it was important, they'll call back. I'm heading home early tonight. Please hold all calls and lock up when you're ready to leave." Sarah watched him walk toward the private elevator, noting for the first time how his gait changed when he thought no one was watching. The confident stride of Henry Blackwood, Manhattan financier, shifted into something more cautious, more watchful. The posture of someone who had learned to disappear into shadows. The elevator doors closed with a soft chime, and Sarah was alone. She waited exactly 10 minutes, counting each second, before opening her computer and accessing the employee directory. Henry Blackwood's profile was sparse. Hire date 3 years ago. Minimal personal information. Previous employment listed simply as international finance. No emergency contacts, no family members, no birthday listed. For a man who managed billions in assets, he left remarkably few traces. Sarah's fingers moved across the keyboard with growing urgency. She accessed the company's digital phone records, scrolling through 3 years of call logs. The patterns were there once she knew what to look for. International calls from the same area codes, always on Thursdays, always right before the compliance meetings. Calls that lasted exactly 90 seconds before disconnecting. Calls that had stopped 3 months ago, until today. The building's security system chirped as the cleaning crew arrived, their voices echoing in the marble lobby 42 floors below. Sarah glanced at the clock, 7:30 p.m. She had been researching for nearly 2 hours, and the pieces of the puzzle were beginning to form a picture she didn't want to see. She opened a new browser window and typed carefully. Heinrich Schwarzwald, Nazi hunter, most wanted. The results loaded slowly, as if the internet itself was reluctant to reveal these secrets. The first link was to a declassified CIA document from 1987, marked with stamps and redactions that spoke of decades-old cover-ups. Sarah's breath caught as she read the summary. Subject: Heinrich Schwarzwald, born 1938, suspected war criminal, believed to have assumed multiple identities following Operation Paperclip investigations. Last confirmed sighting: Buenos Aires, 1986. Subject considered extremely dangerous and likely operating under deep cover in financial sector. Sarah's vision blurred. The numbers didn't add up. If Heinrich Schwarzwald had been born in 1938, he would be 87 years old now. Henry Blackwood was clearly in his 60s, vigorous and sharp. Either the documents were wrong or Henry Blackwood was Heinrich Schwarzwald's son. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The caller's words echoed in her memory. Tell him his father calls, not tell Heinrich his father calls. The distinction was crucial. The caller had known she would understand, had known that mentioning the father would be enough to identify the son. Sarah's hands shook as she printed the document, the laser printer's hum unnaturally loud in the empty office. She folded the papers carefully and slipped them into her purse, her mind racing through the implications. If Henry Blackwood was the son of a Nazi war criminal, if he had been operating under a false identity for decades, then Blackwood and Associates wasn't just a private equity firm. It was a front for something far more sinister. The money they moved, the clients they served, the weekly document destruction. It all made horrible sense now. She thought of the Swiss bank accounts, the clients who spoke in whispers, The way certain names made Blackwood's jaw tighten. How many stolen assets had been laundered through their legitimate business? How many victims' families had been cheated out of their rightful inheritance? Sarah stood up abruptly, knocking over her coffee mug. The dark liquid spread across her desk, soaking into the leather appointment book that contained 3 years of carefully recorded meetings, phone calls, and appointments. 3 years of being an unwitting accomplice to something she was only beginning to understand. She grabbed paper towels from the supply closet, her movements mechanical as her mind grappled with the enormity of what she had discovered. Every transaction she had processed, every call she had transferred, every document she had filed, all of it potentially tainted by the sins of the past. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her younger brother Marcus. "Hey, still on for dinner Saturday? Mom's making her famous lasagna." Sarah stared at the message, thinking of her family's modest apartment in Queens, her brother's student loans, her mother's medical bills. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had taken the job at Blackwood & Associates specifically because it paid well enough to help support her family. The generous salary, the excellent benefits, the year-end bonuses that had seemed too good to be true. Because they were too good to be true. The money that had helped pay for her brother's education, her mother's medications, her own small apartment. It was all connected to blood money, to the systematic theft and murder of innocents decades ago. She thought of her grandmother's tattooed wrist, of the photograph she had never been allowed to see clearly, of the way the old woman's eyes had gone distant when German voices drifted from the television. Sarah's phone rang, the shrill sound cutting through her thoughts like a blade. She glanced at the caller ID. International, same area code as the earlier call. Her finger hovered over the answer button, trembling with the weight of decision. If she answered, there would be no going back. If she ignored it, she could pretend this day had never happened, could continue her life as Sarah Mitchell, efficient secretary, loving daughter, helpful sister. She could deposit her next paycheck without thinking about where the money came from, could smile at Henry Blackwood without seeing the shadow of Heinrich Schwarzwald lurking behind his eyes. But the phone kept ringing, insistent and demanding, and Sarah found herself thinking of her grandmother's final words. Some secrets are too heavy for one person to carry. She answered on the 7th ring. Blackwood & Associates, Sarah speaking. You did not give him my message. The voice was different this time, younger, American, but with the same undertone of authority that had characterized the first caller. I'm sorry, I don't understand. Heinrich Schwarzwald, you spoke to his father today. You did not deliver the message. Sarah's blood turned to ice. Who is this? Someone who has been waiting a very long time for this conversation. My name is David Goldman, and I believe you have questions about your employer. The line went quiet except for the sound of Sarah's labored breathing. In the background, she could hear the faint sounds of traffic, the distant hum of a city that never slept. New York City, she realized. The call was coming from somewhere in New York. I don't know what you're talking about. Tomorrow morning, Heinrich Schwarzwald will fire you. He will give you a generous severance package and a glowing reference letter. He will make sure you never work in finance again, but he will do it so smoothly that you will thank him for the privilege. Sarah's grip tightened on the phone. How do you know that? Because I have been watching him for 30 years, waiting for the right moment. You, Sarah Mitchell, are that moment. You answered the phone call. You heard the German. You searched for the truth. I don't understand. You understand more than you want to admit. The question is, are you going to let him destroy you like he has destroyed everyone else who got too close to the truth? Or are you going to help me finish what my grandfather started in 1945? Sarah closed her eyes, seeing her grandmother's face, remembering the way the old woman's hands had shaken when she spoke of the past. What do you want from me? I want you to be ready. Tomorrow, when Heinrich Schwarzwald fires you, I want you to remember this conversation. And I want you to call me. The line went dead, leaving Sarah alone with the weight of knowledge she had never wanted to possess. Sarah arrived at the office the next morning 30 minutes early, her usual routine disrupted by a sleepless night filled with fragmented dreams of her grandmother's whispered German and the sound of shredding paper. The building's marble lobby felt different somehow, more oppressive, as if the weight of its secrets had grown heavier overnight. She nodded to the security guard, Roberto, who had greeted her with the same warm smile for 3 years, and wondered if he too was unknowingly complicit in whatever Henry Blackwood was hiding. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor seemed to take forever, each floor marking another step toward an inevitable confrontation she wasn't sure she was prepared for. Sarah's reflection in the polished steel doors showed a woman who looked remarkably composed despite the turmoil churning inside her. Her dark hair was pulled back in its usual neat bun, her navy suit pressed and professional, her makeup carefully applied to hide the dark circles under her eyes. She had always been good at maintaining facades, a skill that had served her well in corporate America, and one that might be the only thing standing between her and complete destruction. The office was empty when she arrived, the familiar silence broken only by the hum of computers and the distant rumble of traffic far below. Sarah made her way to her desk, noting how everything looked exactly the same as it had the night before. The leather appointment book still stained with coffee, the Mont Blanc pen set perfectly aligned, the crystal paperweight catching the morning light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Yet everything felt different, as if she was seeing it all through a new lens that revealed the shadows lurking behind the polished surfaces. She sat down and opened her computer, her fingers automatically navigating to the daily schedule. Henry Blackwood had 3 meetings scheduled: a 9 a.m. with the Swiss Banking Consortium, a 10:30 with the compliance team, and a 2 p.m. with someone listed only as H. Weber. The name made her stomach clench. Weber had been one of the most common surnames in the documents she had found the night before, appearing repeatedly in connection with Operation Paperclip and the post-war Nazi escape networks. Sarah opened a new document and began typing her resignation letter, her fingers moving with mechanical precision as she crafted the carefully worded explanation that would give her some semblance of control over her departure. If David Goldman was right, if Blackwood was planning to fire her, then she would beat him to it. She would leave on her own terms, with her dignity intact and her conscience clear. But as she typed, doubt crept in. What if she was wrong? What if her research had led her down a rabbit hole of conspiracy theories and misidentified documents? What if Henry Blackwood was exactly who he claimed to be, and she was about to destroy her career over a phone call from a confused old man looking for someone who didn't exist? The elevator chimed softly, and Sarah quickly minimized the resignation letter as Henry Blackwood stepped into the reception area. He looked exactly as he always did, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Sarah made in a month, his silver hair perfectly styled, his blue eyes sharp and alert. But now Sarah found herself studying him with new eyes, looking for traces of his father in the set of his jaw, the way he held his shoulders, the carefully controlled expression that never quite reached his eyes. "Good morning, Sarah. You're here early today." His voice carried the same warm authority it always had, but Sarah thought she detected something else beneath the surface, a tension that hadn't been there before. "Good morning, Mr. Blackwood. I wanted to get a head start on the day." She managed to keep her voice steady, professional, giving no hint of the storm raging inside her. He paused beside her desk, his gaze lingering on the coffee stain that had spread across her appointment book. "I'm sorry about yesterday's call. I know international clients can be difficult to handle." The words hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning that Sarah was only beginning to understand. He knew. Somehow, he knew about the call, about her reaction, about the questions that had kept her awake all night. The realization hit her like a physical blow, but she forced herself to remain calm, to play the part of the efficient secretary who had no idea that her world was about to collapse. "It was no trouble at all, sir. Just a wrong number." Blackwood's smile was warm and paternal, exactly the expression that had made her feel safe and valued for 3 years. "I'm glad to hear it. Could you bring me coffee in 10 minutes? I have some paperwork to review before my first meeting. Sarah nodded, watching as he walked toward his office with that same fluid grace she had always admired. Only now she recognized it for what it was, the careful movement of a predator who had learned to hide in plain sight. She waited until his door closed before allowing herself to breathe again, her hands shaking as she reached for the phone. David Goldman's business card was tucked into her purse, the simple white rectangle bearing only a name and a phone number. No company, no title, no indication of who he was or what he wanted beyond the conversation they had shared the night before. Sarah stared at the card for a long moment, knowing that making the call would be crossing a line from which there was no return. She dialed the number. Goldman. The voice was crisp, professional, with none of the conspiratorial whispers she had expected. This is Sarah Mitchell. We spoke last night. I know. Are you calling from the office? Sarah glanced toward Blackwood's closed door, noting the thin line of light visible beneath it. Yes. Then we need to be careful. Heinrich has ways of monitoring communications that go beyond simple phone taps. Can you meet me for lunch? There's a small cafe called Morningside on East 47th Street. 1 o'clock. I don't know if I can leave the office. You'll be able to leave. Trust me. The line went dead, leaving Sarah alone with her racing thoughts and the growing certainty that she was trapped in a situation far more complex and dangerous than she had imagined. She made Blackwood's coffee with automatic precision, her hands steady despite the chaos in her mind, and knocked softly on his door. Come in. Blackwood's office was a study in understated luxury, rich mahogany furniture, Persian rugs, oil paintings that spoke of old money and older secrets. He was seated behind his massive desk, a stack of documents spread before him, his Mont Blanc pen moving with practiced efficiency across pages that Sarah couldn't quite see from her position by the door. Your coffee, sir. Thank you, Sarah. Please sit down. I'd like to discuss something with you. Sarah felt her heart skip a beat as she lowered herself into the leather chair facing his desk. This was it. The moment David Goldman had predicted, the conversation that would end her employment and potentially her life as she knew it. I've been thinking about your career trajectory, Blackwood began, his voice warm and conversational. You've been an exemplary employee for 3 years, and I think it's time we discussed your future. My future, sir? I've been offered a position with a consortium in Switzerland. It's a significant opportunity, but it would mean relocating the operation, scaling back our New York presence. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him. I'm afraid that would mean letting go of most of our current staff. Sarah forced herself to remain calm, to play the part of the surprised and disappointed employee. I see. When would this take effect? Immediately. I know it's sudden, but these opportunities don't wait for convenient timing. He opened a leather folder and withdrew a thick envelope. I've prepared a generous severance package, 6-month salary, plus a bonus for your years of dedicated service. And of course, I'll provide the most glowing reference letter possible. Sarah stared at the envelope, seeing in it the price of her silence, the cost of her complicity. 6-month salary would be enough to support her family while she looked for another job, enough to ease the transition and make her grateful for his generosity. It was perfectly calculated, like everything else about Henry Blackwood. That's very generous, sir. I believe in taking care of the people who have taken care of me. He slid the envelope across the desk, his blue eyes watching her carefully. There is one small matter, however. Given the sensitive nature of our client relationships, I'll need you to sign an updated non-disclosure agreement, standard procedure for departing employees. Sarah picked up the envelope, noting its weight, the expensive paper, the way it felt substantial and final in her hands. Inside would be more money than she had ever seen at one time, enough to solve her family's financial problems and set her up for a comfortable transition to her next job. All she had to do was sign a piece of paper promising never to talk about what she had learned, never to ask questions about Heinrich Schwarzwald or Operation Paperclip or the phone calls that had changed everything. Of course, sir. I understand completely. Blackwood's smile was warm and genuine, the expression of a man who had just successfully navigated a potentially dangerous situation. "I'm glad we could handle this so amicably. You've been a pleasure to work with, Sarah. I hope you'll think of your time here fondly." Sarah stood up, the envelope clutched in her hands, and walked toward the door. At the threshold, she paused and turned back to face him. "Mr. Blackwood? Yes? The call yesterday, was it from your father?" The question hung in the air between them like a loaded gun. For a moment, neither of them moved, neither of them breathed. Then Blackwood's expression shifted, the warm paternal mask slipping just enough to reveal something cold and calculating beneath. "I'm not sure what you mean, Sarah." "Heinrich Schwarzwald. That's what the caller said. He was looking for Heinrich Schwarzwald." Blackwood's hand moved almost imperceptibly toward the desk drawer, and Sarah realized with crystal clarity that she had just made a potentially fatal mistake. Whatever was in that drawer, a gun, a panic button, a communication device, it represented the end of any pretense of civility between them. "I think you've been under a lot of stress lately," Blackwood said carefully, his voice taking on a different quality, harder and more dangerous. "Perhaps you should take some time to rest, to process this transition. Memory can be a tricky thing when we're emotional." Sarah understood the threat implicit in his words, the suggestion that her memory might be unreliable, that her version of events might not be believed. She nodded slowly, clutching the envelope tighter. "You're right, sir. I've been under a lot of stress. I should probably leave now. That would be best." Sarah walked out of the office on unsteady legs, her mind reeling from the confrontation and its implications. She gathered her personal belongings from her desk, a small potted plant, a framed photo of her family, a coffee mug her brother had given her for Christmas. 3 years of her life condensed into a small cardboard box that felt impossibly heavy as she carried it toward the elevator. The ride down to the lobby was a blur of polished steel and flickering floor numbers. Sarah found herself thinking about her grandmother again, about the way the old woman had spoken of courage and cowardice, of the choices that defined a person's character. She thought about the money in the envelope, about her family's needs, about the comfortable life she could build on the foundation of her silence. And she thought about David Goldman, waiting for her at a cafe on East 47th Street, armed with 30 years of patience and a promise to finish what his grandfather had started. The elevator doors opened onto the marble lobby, and Sarah stepped out into a world that looked exactly the same as it had an hour ago, but felt completely different. She walked past Roberto, who smiled and wished her a good day, past the security cameras that recorded her every movement, past the brass plaque that proclaimed Blackwood and Associates to be a pillar of Manhattan's financial community. Outside, the October air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of autumn leaves and the distant promise of winter. Sarah stood on the sidewalk for a moment, looking up at the gleaming tower that had been her workplace for 3 years, knowing that she would never see it the same way again. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Hope you're having a good day at work, sweetie. Love you." Sarah stared at the message, thinking about love and loyalty, about the price of truth and the cost of lies. She thought about her grandmother's tattooed wrist, about the photograph she had never been allowed to see, about the phone call that had changed everything. Then she hailed a taxi and gave the driver an address on East 47th Street, carrying with her a cardboard box full of memories and an envelope full of blood money, heading toward a meeting that would determine not just her future, but the future of everyone whose lives had been touched by the sins of the past. The cafe on East 47th Street was exactly the kind of place Sarah would have walked past without a second glance. A narrow storefront squeezed between a dry cleaner and a newsstand, with mismatched furniture and the comfortable shabbiness of a business that survived on loyalty rather than atmosphere. She arrived 15 minutes early, her cardboard box of office belongings tucked under one arm, the envelope of blood money burning like a coal in her purse. She chose a table in the back corner, positioning herself so she could watch both the entrance and the street beyond. The paranoia felt foreign, like wearing clothes that didn't quite fit, but she was beginning to understand that her old life, the life of Sarah Mitchell, efficient secretary, had ended the moment she answered that phone call in German. David Goldman arrived exactly at 1 o'clock, and Sarah recognized him immediately, despite having never seen him before. He was in his 50s, tall and lean, with prematurely gray hair and the kind of quiet intensity that made people instinctively lower their voices in his presence. His eyes were dark and intelligent, carrying the weight of someone who had seen too much and remembered everything. He slid into the seat across from her without ceremony, his gaze sweeping the cafe with practiced efficiency before settling on her face. "You came. I wasn't entirely certain you would." "I wasn't certain either." Sarah's voice was steadier than she felt. "But here I am." "Yes, here you are, with a cardboard box and an envelope full of Heinrich's money." His smile was thin, humorless. He's very predictable once you understand his patterns. The generous severance, the glowing reference, the subtle threats disguised as concern for your well-being. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "You were watching?" "I've been watching Heinrich Schwarzwald for 30 years. Watching and waiting and gathering evidence that no one in authority wants to see." He signaled the waitress, a tired-looking woman in her 60s who brought him coffee without being asked. "You're not the first person to stumble onto his secret. You're just the first one to survive the discovery long enough to matter." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. "What happened to the others?" "Car accidents mostly. A few suicides. One very tragic case of food poisoning." Goldman's tone was matter-of-fact, clinical. Heinrich learned from his father that the most effective way to eliminate problems is to make them disappear without raising questions. A grieving family accepts an accident more easily than they accept murder. Sarah's hand tightened around her coffee cup, the ceramic warm against her suddenly cold fingers. "Are you saying he killed them?" "I'm saying that Heinrich Schwarzwald has been very lucky when it comes to former employees who ask too many questions." Goldman leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "But you're different, Sarah. You have something the others didn't." "What's that?" "You have me." The waitress approached their table, and Goldman ordered a turkey sandwich with the casual ease of someone who had eaten here many times before. Sarah asked for the same, though she doubted she would be able to eat anything. Her stomach was churning with a mixture of fear and fascination, the vertigo of standing at the edge of an abyss and realizing that the only way forward was to jump. "Tell me about your grandfather," she said quietly. Goldman's expression softened slightly, revealing a glimpse of the man beneath the hunter's mask. "Simon Goldman. He was a prosecutor at Nuremberg, one of the men tasked with documenting the Nazi war crimes and bringing the perpetrators to justice. He spent 2 years cataloging horrors that most people couldn't imagine, building cases against men who had turned murder into an industrial process." He paused, his fingers tracing patterns on the scratched tabletop. "My grandfather was a methodical man, obsessed with detail and documentation. He kept copies of everything: transcripts, photographs, witness statements, financial records. He believed that if he could just gather enough evidence, if he could just build a strong enough case, justice would prevail." "Did it?" Goldman's laugh was bitter. "Some of it. The big names, the obvious monsters, they were tried and executed or imprisoned. But the smaller fish, the ones who were clever enough to hide their tracks or valuable enough to be useful to the Allies, they slipped through the cracks. Operation Paperclip brought over 1,000 Nazi scientists and engineers to America, supposedly for their technical expertise. But they brought their families, their connections, their stolen wealth with them." The waitress brought their sandwiches, and Sarah stared at hers without appetite. "And Heinrich Schwarzwald Sr. was one of them?" Heinrich Schwarzwald Sr. was much more than a rocket scientist or an engineer. He was a financial architect, one of the men who designed the systems for looting Jewish assets and funneling stolen wealth to secret accounts across the globe. He understood how to make money disappear and reappear, how to launder blood through legitimate businesses, how to turn genocide into profit. Goldman took a bite of his sandwich, chewing thoughtfully before continuing. When the war ended, Heinrich Sr. saw the writing on the wall. He destroyed his records, killed his assistants, and disappeared with a fortune in stolen gold, artwork, and bank accounts. The Allies found evidence of his crimes, but they never found him. Until now. Until now. My grandfather never stopped looking, never stopped gathering evidence. When he died in 1987, he left me everything. Boxes of documents, photographs, financial records, witness statements. A life's work devoted to finding men who had vanished into new identities. Sarah thought of her own grandmother, of the numbers tattooed on her wrist, of the photograph she had never been allowed to see. And you've been continuing his work. I've been continuing his work. For 30 years, I've been tracking the Schwarzwald family, following the money, documenting the network of businesses and shell companies they've used to launder their stolen wealth. I've identified dozens of victims, families who were robbed of their life savings, their homes, their heirlooms. I've built cases that could put Heinrich Sr. in prison for the rest of his life. But he's dead, isn't he? The man who called yesterday, he sounded old, but not that old. Goldman's eyes glittered with something that might have been satisfaction. Heinrich Sr. is 97 years old and living in a private medical facility in Argentina. He's dying, Sarah. Brain cancer, according to his medical records. He has perhaps 6 months to live. Then why does any of this matter? Because Heinrich Sr. isn't the only Schwarzwald. He has a son born in 1961 in Buenos Aires, a son who was educated in Swiss boarding schools, who studied finance at the London School of Economics, who has been managing his father's stolen wealth for the past 30 years under the identity of Henry Blackwood. Sarah felt the pieces clicking into place, the horrible logic of it all becoming clear. The phone call yesterday, it was Heinrich Sr. calling his son. Heinrich Sr. is dying, and he wants to see his son one last time. He wants to pass on the locations of the remaining accounts, the final secrets that will allow Heinrich Jr. to complete his father's work. But Heinrich Jr. has been very careful to avoid any contact with his father, to maintain his false identity at all costs. Until yesterday, when a confused old man, dying and desperate, called the office directly instead of using the usual intermediaries. When he spoke German to an American secretary who understood more than she was supposed to. Goldman leaned back in his chair, studying Sarah's face. You represent the first crack in a facade that Heinrich Jr. has spent 30 years perfecting. Sarah stared at the envelope in her purse, understanding now why the severance package had been so generous. He's trying to buy my silence. He's trying to buy your silence, and if that doesn't work, he'll try other methods. Heinrich Jr. learned everything his father taught him about making problems disappear. Goldman's voice turned urgent. Which is why we need to move quickly. The phone call yesterday changed everything. Heinrich Sr. won't wait much longer, and Heinrich Jr. can't afford to let anyone connect him to his father's crimes. What do you want me to do? Goldman reached into his jacket and withdrew a small device that looked like a smartphone but felt heavier, more substantial. This is a recording device designed to look like a standard phone. It will capture everything: audio, video, GPS coordinates, even biometric data. I want you to go back to Heinrich Jr. to tell him you've reconsidered his offer. Sarah's blood ran cold. You want me to go back to him, after what you just told me? I want you to help me finish what my grandfather started. Heinrich Jr. is planning to disappear, Sarah. Within the next few days, Henry Blackwood will cease to exist, and Heinrich Schwarzwald Jr. will vanish into a new identity with billions of dollars in stolen wealth. This is our only chance to stop him. And if he kills me? Goldman's expression was grim but determined. Then you'll die knowing that you helped bring justice to thousands of victims who have been waiting 70 years for someone to care about their stolen lives. He pushed the device across the table. But I don't think he'll kill you. Not immediately. He needs to know what you know, who you've told, whether you represent a broader threat to his operation. Sarah stared at the device, her mind racing through the implications. What exactly are you asking me to do? I'm asking you to be brave. I'm asking you to walk back into that office and convince Heinrich Jr. that you're willing to play along, that you understand the benefits of cooperation. I'm asking you to get close enough to him to record a confession, to document his crimes, to gather the evidence we need to expose him. And then we contact the FBI, the State Department, the International Criminal Court. We release the evidence to the press, to the families of the victims, to anyone who will listen. We make sure that Heinrich Schwarzwald Jr. spends the rest of his life in prison, and we recover as much of the stolen wealth as possible. Sarah picked up the device, feeling its weight in her hands. It was heavier than she had expected, solid and real in a way that made her decision feel final. How do I know you're not just using me? How do I know you're not as dangerous as he is? Goldman reached into his wallet and withdrew a faded photograph, placing it carefully on the table between them. It showed a young man in a prosecutor's uniform standing next to a pile of documents, his face grim but determined. Behind him, barely visible in the background, was a woman with numbers tattooed on her wrist. That's my grandfather at Nuremberg. The woman behind him is Rebecca Hoffman, a survivor who testified about her family's stolen savings, their confiscated business, their murdered relatives. She was one of hundreds of witnesses who trusted my grandfather to find justice for them. Sarah stared at the photograph, seeing in the woman's face an echo of her own grandmother's expression, the same mixture of pain and hope that had haunted the old woman's eyes. What happened to her? She died in 1963, still waiting for justice, still hoping that someday someone would care enough to find the men who had stolen her life and make them pay. Goldman's voice was soft but urgent. I've been carrying her story for 30 years, Sarah. I've been carrying the stories of hundreds of victims who died without ever seeing justice. This is my chance to honor their memory. Sarah slipped the device into her purse, feeling its weight settle next to the envelope of blood money. What if I can't do it? What if I'm not brave enough? Then you'll be no different from the thousands of people who have looked the other way, who have chosen comfort over courage, who have allowed evil to flourish because it was easier than fighting it. Goldman's eyes were hard but not unkind. But I don't think you're one of those people, Sarah. I think you're someone who cares about justice, who understands that some fights are worth the risk. Sarah stood up, her legs unsteady but her resolve growing stronger. How do I contact you? You don't. The device will transmit everything to a secure server. If you're successful, if you get the evidence we need, I'll find you. If you're not, he shrugged. Then at least you'll have tried to do the right thing. Sarah walked out of the cafe carrying her cardboard box and her dangerous new purpose, the October sun warm on her face as she hailed a taxi back to the building that had been her workplace for 3 years. The driver was chatty, making observations about the weather and the traffic, but Sarah barely heard him. Her mind was focused on the conversation ahead, on the performance she would need to give, on the very real possibility that she was about to walk into a trap that would cost her everything. As the taxi pulled up to the gleaming tower that housed Blackwood and Associates, Sarah thought about courage and cowardice, about the choice between comfort and justice, about the stories of victims who had died without ever seeing the men who had stolen their lives brought to account. She thought about her grandmother's tattooed wrist, about the photograph she had never been allowed to see, about the phone call that had changed everything. And she walked back into the building, carrying with her the weight of 30 years of investigation, the hopes of hundreds of victims, and a small device that might finally bring justice to the sins of the past. Sarah stood in the elevator, watching the numbers climb toward the 42nd floor, her reflection fractured into a dozen fragments in the polished steel doors. Each fragment seemed to represent a different version of herself: the dutiful secretary, the loving daughter, the reluctant detective, the potential victim. In her purse, the recording device felt like a live grenade, its weight a constant reminder of the choice she had made and the danger that waited above. The elevator chimed softly as it reached her floor, and Sarah stepped out into the reception area that had been her domain for 3 years. Everything looked exactly as she had left it. The leather appointment book still stained with coffee, the crystal paperweight catching the afternoon light, the familiar hum of expensive electronics managing billions of dollars in assets. But now she saw it all through different eyes, understanding that every transaction, every phone call, every carefully managed meeting had been part of a 70-year-old conspiracy to legitimize stolen wealth. The office was quieter than usual, the usual bustle of financial activity replaced by an almost oppressive silence. Sarah noticed that the compliance team wasn't there, their desks empty and cleared of the usual stacks of documents. The cleaning crew had been unusually thorough, she realized. No trace remained of the papers that had been shredded the day before, no evidence of the weekly meetings that had been Heinrich Jr.'s way of destroying inconvenient truths. "Sarah?" Henry Blackwood's voice came from his office, warm and concerned. "Is that you? I didn't expect you back today." Sarah took a deep breath, steadying herself for the performance of her life. "I'm sorry to bother you, Mr. Blackwood." "I was hoping we could talk." "Of course. Please come in." She walked into his office, noting how his hand moved almost imperceptibly toward the desk drawer before relaxing when he saw her empty hands. The cardboard box sat on the floor beside her chair, a prop in the theater of her supposed capitulation. "I wanted to thank you again for the generous severance package," she began, her voice carefully modulated to sound grateful but slightly troubled. 6 months' salary is incredibly generous, especially given the circumstances. Blackwood's smile was warm but watchful. "You've been an excellent employee, Sarah. I believe in taking care of people who have served the company well." "That's what I wanted to talk about. Serving the company." Sarah leaned forward slightly, allowing a note of desperation to creep into her voice. "The thing is, Mr. Blackwood, I've been thinking about what you said yesterday. About opportunities in Switzerland, about the kind of work you do there. I'm not sure I follow." "I think you do." Sarah met his eyes directly, letting him see the calculation behind her apparent vulnerability. "I understand that your business involves discretion, privacy, the kind of work that requires absolute loyalty and the ability to keep secrets." Blackwood's expression didn't change, but Sarah caught the slight narrowing of his eyes, the way his fingers tightened around his Mont Blanc pen. "I'm still not sure what you're suggesting." "I'm suggesting that maybe I don't want to be just another former employee with a severance package and a non-disclosure agreement. Maybe I want to be someone you can trust, someone who understands the value of loyalty and discretion." Sarah's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Someone who knows that Heinrich Schwarzwald Jr. is a man who takes care of his people." The silence that followed was so complete that Sarah could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the weight of the recording device in her purse, documenting every word, every breath, every moment of this dangerous gamble. Blackwood sat perfectly still, his blue eyes studying her face with the intensity of a predator evaluating potential prey. "That's an interesting name," he said finally. "Heinrich Schwarzwald. Where did you hear it?" "From the phone call yesterday, from your father." The mask slipped. For just a moment, the warm, paternal expression that had defined Henry Blackwood for 3 years cracked, revealing something cold and calculating beneath. Sarah saw the man who had learned from his father how to make problems disappear, how to turn murder into profit, how to wear the face of respectability while orchestrating systematic theft. "My father is a confused old man, dying in a medical facility in Argentina. He sometimes calls numbers from his past, looking for people who no longer exist." Blackwood's voice was steady, but Sarah could hear the tension beneath the surface. "I'm not sure why that would interest you. Because I did some research last night. Because I understand now what kind of business you're really in." Sarah pulled out her phone, not the recording device, but her regular phone, and showed him a photograph she had found online. Operation Paperclip, Nazi scientists and engineers brought to America after the war. Men who brought their families, their connections, their stolen wealth with them. Blackwood glanced at the photograph, his expression unreadable. History is a complicated thing, Sarah. The winners write the narratives, but the truth is often more nuanced than what you'll find in textbooks or internet searches. The truth is that your father was Heinrich Schwarzwald Sr., a financial architect who helped design the systems for looting Jewish assets during the Holocaust. The truth is that he disappeared after the war with a fortune in stolen gold, artwork, and bank accounts. The truth is that you've been managing that stolen wealth for 30 years under the identity of Henry Blackwood. The words hung in the air between them like an accusation and a confession. Sarah watched Blackwood's face, looking for any sign of denial, any attempt to maintain the fiction of Henry Blackwood, legitimate businessman. Instead, she saw something that looked almost like relief. "And what exactly do you plan to do with this truth?" he asked quietly. "I plan to be part of it." Sarah leaned back in her chair, trying to project confidence despite the fear coursing through her veins. "I plan to help you continue your father's work, to be someone you can trust with the real business of Blackwood and Associates." Blackwood stood up and walked to the window, gazing out at the Manhattan skyline that had been his kingdom for 3 years. "Do you know what my father taught me about trust, Sarah? He taught me that trust is a luxury that men in our position cannot afford. He taught me that the moment you begin to trust someone, you give them the power to destroy you. But you have to trust someone. You can't manage a financial empire entirely alone. No, you can't. But you can be very careful about who you trust, and you can make sure that the people you trust understand the consequences of betrayal." He turned back to face her, his expression serious but not unkind. "Tell me, Sarah, what makes you think you're someone I could trust?" Sarah felt the weight of the question, understanding that her answer would determine not just her future, but potentially her survival. "Because I'm already complicit. Because I've been processing your transactions, managing your communications, facilitating your meetings for 3 years. Because if you go down, I go down with you." That's a practical answer, but practical answers aren't always sufficient. Blackwood returned to his desk, opening a leather folder that contained documents Sarah couldn't see. "My father built his fortune on the principle that money has no memory, no conscience, no loyalty to the people who originally owned it. He believed that wealth, properly managed, could be laundered through time itself, that after enough years, enough transactions, enough degrees of separation, stolen money becomes simply money. And you've been proving his theory. I've been managing assets that would otherwise sit in Swiss bank accounts, earning interest for no one. I've been providing services to clients who value discretion above all else. I've been facilitating the kind of transactions that keep the global economy functioning smoothly." His voice took on a lecturing tone, as if he were explaining basic principles to a student. "The money my father acquired during the war has been invested in hospitals, schools, infrastructure projects. It has created jobs, funded research, improved countless lives." Sarah felt a surge of anger at the casual way he dismissed the origins of his wealth, the way he transformed theft and murder into economic theory. And the families who were robbed? The people who died? What about their lives? "The dead are dead, Sarah. The living have needs that can be met with properly managed resources." Blackwood's voice was matter-of-fact, devoid of emotion. "I can't bring back the victims of the Holocaust, but I can ensure that their stolen wealth serves a productive purpose in the modern world, by laundering it through your father's network of businesses and shell companies, by managing it efficiently and discreetly, by ensuring that it serves the needs of clients who understand the value of privacy and the importance of discretion." He closed the folder and fixed her with a direct stare. "The question is whether you're someone who can understand those same principles." Sarah felt the moment balancing on a knife's edge. Everything depended on her next words, on her ability to convince Heinrich Jr. that she was willing to become part of his conspiracy. "I understand that 6 months severance isn't enough to build a life on. I understand that keeping secrets can be more profitable than revealing them. I understand that some opportunities only come along once. Blackwood nodded slowly, as if considering her words. And if I were to offer you such an opportunity, what would you expect in return? A position in your Swiss operation, a salary commensurate with the level of discretion required, the kind of security that comes from being essential rather than expendable. Those are reasonable expectations, but they would come with certain obligations, absolute loyalty, complete discretion, the understanding that betrayal would have consequences that extend far beyond simple termination. Sarah felt the chill in his words, the subtle threat that lay beneath the business language. I understand. Do you? Because once you cross this line, Sarah, there's no going back. You become part of something that has existed for 70 years, something that will continue to exist long after we're both gone. You become complicit in ways that can't be undone. I'm already complicit. The question is whether I'm going to be compensated for it. Blackwood smiled, and for the first time since she had known him, the expression seemed genuine. I think we understand each other. There are some documents I'd like you to review, some accounts I'd like you to familiarize yourself with. Consider it a trial period, a chance for both of us to evaluate whether this arrangement will be mutually beneficial. He opened his desk drawer and withdrew a thick manila folder, placing it on the desk between them. Sarah could see the edges of bank statements, wire transfer records, account numbers that represented fortunes built on the bones of the dead. Take your time reviewing these. We'll discuss the details tomorrow, along with the arrangements for your relocation to Switzerland. He paused, studying her face. I hope you understand what you're committing to, Sarah. This isn't just a job. It's a way of life, a worldview, a commitment to principles that most people would find challenging. Sarah reached for the folder, feeling the weight of evidence that could potentially destroy Heinrich Jr.'s carefully constructed empire. I understand perfectly. Good. Then welcome to the real Blackwood and Associates. Sarah stood up, clutching the folder to her chest, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and triumph. She had done it. She had convinced Heinrich Jr. to trust her, to reveal the scope of his operation, to provide her with documentation that could expose 70 years of systematic theft and murder. There's one more thing, Blackwood said as she reached the door. The phone call yesterday, my father's call. I'll need to know exactly what he said, exactly how you responded. For security purposes, you understand. Sarah turned back to face him, knowing that this moment would determine whether she walked out of the building alive or whether she joined the list of former employees who had died in convenient accidents. He asked if Heinrich was there. He said to tell you that your father calls. I told him he had the wrong number. And you didn't mention this to anyone else? Who would I mention it to? Who would believe me? Blackwood nodded, apparently satisfied with her answer. Very good. I'll see you tomorrow morning, Sarah. We have a great deal to discuss. Sarah walked out of the office, through the reception area, and into the elevator, the folder tucked under her arm like a bomb waiting to explode. The recording device in her purse had captured everything: the confession, the threats, the casual dismissal of genocide as a business expense. She had enough evidence to destroy Heinrich Schwarzwald Jr. and expose the network that had allowed Nazi wealth to flourish in the heart of American capitalism. But as the elevator descended toward the lobby, Sarah realized that the real challenge was just beginning. She had the evidence, but she still had to survive long enough to use it. She had convinced Heinrich Jr. to trust her, but she couldn't be certain that the trust would last beyond the next 24 hours. The elevator doors opened onto the marble lobby, and Sarah stepped out into a world that looked exactly the same as it had that morning, but felt completely different. She walked past Roberto, who smiled and asked about her day, past the security cameras that had recorded her every movement, past the brass plaque that proclaimed Blackwood and Associates to be a pillar of Manhattan's financial community. Outside, the October sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of red and gold, that reminded Sarah of the photographs she had seen of burning synagogues, of looted homes, of lives destroyed by the systematic greed of men who had learned to turn human suffering into profit. Her phone buzzed with a text from her brother. "How was work today? Mom's making pot roast for dinner if you want to come over." Sarah stared at the message, thinking about family and loyalty, about the price of justice and the cost of silence. She thought about her grandmother's tattooed wrist, about the photograph she had never been allowed to see, about the phone call that had changed everything. Then she walked to the nearest coffee shop, sat in a corner booth, and began photographing every document in the folder, uploading each image to a secure server that would ensure the evidence survived, even if she didn't. Across the street, in a black sedan with tinted windows, David Goldman watched and waited, knowing that the next 24 hours would determine whether 70 years of patient investigation would finally result in justice, or whether another secretary would become another convenient accident in the long history of the Schwarzwald family. The sun set over Manhattan, and the final act of a drama that had begun in the ashes of the Holocaust moved toward its inevitable conclusion. Sarah Mitchell, former secretary and reluctant hero, had become the last hope for justice in a world that had learned to forget the sins of the past. The hunt was nearly over. The reckoning had begun.